She smelled like lavender and old books. That is the first thing I think of when I remember my grandmother, Eleanor Voss. Not the hospital smell that clung to her in those last weeks, not the antiseptic sting of the hallway outside her room, but lavender and old books, the way her house always smelled, the way she always smelled when she pulled me against her chest as a child and held me like she was afraid the world might try to take me away. I did not know then how right she was to be afraid. She died on a Tuesday morning in October, when the sky outside was the particular shade of gray that makes everything feel already half gone. I got the call at 6:43 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been lying awake for an hour already, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, unable to explain the hollow feeling that had been sitting in my chest since the night before. I think some part of me already knew. Some thread between us had gone quietly slack in the dark. Her name was Eleanor Margaret Voss, and she was 81 years old, and she was the only person in my family who ever made me feel like I belonged to something worth belonging to. I drove to the hospital in the early morning quiet, and by the time I arrived, my parents were already there. My father, Richard, was standing in the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set in that particular way that always meant he was calculating something. My mother, Patricia, was seated in one of those plastic chairs they put in hospital hallways, her phone face down in her lap, her expression composed in a way that looked practiced. They both looked up when I walked in. My father gave me a single nod. My mother said, "She went peacefully," in a tone that was meant to sound comforting but landed somewhere closer to administrative. I went in to see her. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, which was still warm in a way that felt cruel, and I talked to her for a while. I told her about the drive over, how the streets had been empty and the traffic lights were all blinking yellow. I told her I had found the book she had lent me 2 summers ago and that I had finally finished it, and she had been right. It was extraordinary. I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry I had not visited more in the last few months. I told her a lot of things that I had been saving up without knowing I was saving them. When I came back out into the hallway, my father was on his phone. My mother had moved to a different chair. Neither of them asked me how I was doing. The days that followed passed in that strange, suspended way that grief does to time, where hours feel simultaneously too long and too short, where you keep forgetting things and then suddenly remembering them with a sharpness that stops you in the middle of whatever you are doing. I forgot she was gone at least a dozen times in the first week. I would think of something I wanted to tell her and reach for my phone before it hit me again. That quiet devastation, that second loss happening over and over. The reading of the will took place 8 days after her death in the office of a lawyer named Gerald Finch, who had handled my grandmother's affairs for over 20 years. It was a small office that smelled like coffee and old carpet, and there were 4 of us seated around a table that was slightly too large for the room. My father, my mother, my Aunt Diane, who was my grandmother's younger sister, and me. Aunt Diane had flown in from Portland and was wearing a black blazer and holding a handkerchief she never actually used. My parents sat together across from me, which felt, even then, like a statement of alignment. Gerald Finch was a soft-spoken man in his late 60s with wire-framed glasses and the careful demeanor of someone who had spent decades delivering news that changed people's lives. He read from the document in a steady, measured voice, pausing at intervals in a way that felt deliberate, like a musician controlling tempo. My grandmother had been, by any reasonable measure, a woman of considerable means. Her late husband, my grandfather Theodore, had built a construction company in the 1960s that he eventually sold in 1989 for a sum that, even adjusted for time, represented real wealth. My grandmother had managed that wealth carefully, quietly, and well. The family knew she had money. The family had always known she had money, but the exact shape of it had never been fully visible because my grandmother was not the kind of woman who put things on display. Gerald Finch read through the inventory of assets, the investment accounts, the stock portfolios, the savings bonds, the jewelry collection, which alone had been appraised at somewhere in the range of $400,000, the vacation property in the mountains of North Carolina, a place my grandmother had owned since the late 70s and had taken me to every summer until I was 12. The main residence, a 4-bedroom colonial on Ashford Lane, where she had lived for over 40 years and which had been recently appraised at just under $1.2 million. I watched my father's face as Gerald Finch read. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He was listening the way a person listens when they are counting. The bulk of the estate, Gerald Finch explained, had been left to my father as her only child. This included the investment accounts, the stock portfolio, the savings bonds, the jewelry, the vacation property in North Carolina, and the main residence on Ashford Lane. Aunt Diane received a specific bequest, a painting she had always admired, a set of first-edition books, and a cash sum of $30,000. She seemed genuinely moved by this, dabbing at her eyes with the unused handkerchief. Then Gerald Finch looked at me. "To her grandson, Daniel Voss," he said. "Eleanor leaves the property at 412 Mercer Road." There was a pause that lasted no more than 2 seconds, but it felt much longer. "The Mercer Road property," my father said, and his voice was perfectly neutral, "is the old house." "Yes," Gerald Finch said. My mother made a small sound that she quickly converted into a clearing of her throat. I knew the Mercer Road house. Everyone in the family knew it. It was an old Victorian that my grandparents had bought in the early years of their marriage, before the money, before the construction company took off, when they were still young and optimistic and thought they could fix anything. They had lived there for about a decade before moving to Ashford Lane. After that, the Mercer Road house had been rented out sporadically, then left empty for years, then rented again, then empty again. The last tenant had moved out sometime around 4 years ago, and since then it had sat vacant and deteriorating. The roof had issues. The plumbing was old. There was a section of the back porch that had partially collapsed. The last time anyone had bothered to have it appraised, the number that came back had been generous in describing it as worth $110,000, and that was only because of the land value. In the context of an estate worth several $1,000,000, it was by any calculation a consolation prize. I sat with that for a moment. I sat with the math of it, and with what the math meant, and with the fact that everyone in the room already knew what the math meant and was either carefully not looking at me, or, in my father's case, looking at me with an expression of sympathy so perfectly calibrated that it made my skin crawl. "Daniel," my father said in the car afterward, because he had asked me to ride with them, and I had agreed for reasons I still cannot fully explain. Perhaps some residual hope that the conversation would go differently than I knew it would. "Your grandmother loved you very much. You know that." "I know," I said. "She was not always the most practical woman when it came to these kinds of decisions," my mother said from the passenger seat, looking straight ahead at the road. I did not say anything. "The Mercer Road house is yours to do with as you like," my father said. "If you want to sell it, we can look into that. It might not bring much, but it's something. Or if you want to hold on to it, that's your choice too." "Thank you," I said, because I did not trust what else might come out if I opened my mouth further. That night I sat in my apartment and did not turn any lights on. I sat in the dark and thought about my grandmother, and about the last time I had seen her, a week before she died, when she'd been sitting up in her hospital bed with more alertness than the doctors had been predicting. She had taken my hand in both of hers and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. And then she had said, "Daniel, I need you to know that I see you. I always have." I had told her I knew that. She had squeezed my hand and then said something that I had not thought much of at the time. She had said, "Trust the house." I had assumed she meant it emotionally. I had assumed she was talking about family, about legacy, about something abstract and grandmotherly. The way she sometimes spoke in those small, meaningful phrases that were more feeling than instruction. I had said, "I will, Grandma." She had smiled and let go of my hand. Sitting in the dark that night after the reading of the will, I thought about those 3 words. Trust the house. I turned them over like a stone, looking at the underside, and I could not find anything there except the dull ache of a woman who had loved me and left me a broken-down building while my parents loaded the rest of her life into their own accounts. I told myself it was fine. I told myself she had her reasons. I told myself that my father was her son, and that blood and history and a lifetime of relationship had shaped decisions I was not privy to. I told myself that grief was distorting my perspective. I told myself all of the reasonable things a person tells themselves when they are trying not to feel what they are actually feeling, which was hurt in a way that went down to the bone, a specific kind of hurt that comes not from being overlooked by strangers, but from being made small by the people who were supposed to see you as full-sized. I called my friend Marcus that night. He had known my grandmother too, had come to dinner at her house several times over the years, had once told me that she was the kind of person who made you feel smarter just by the way she listened to you. I told him about the will. There was a silence on the other end of the phone. "The old house on Mercer?" he said. "Yeah. What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet." Another silence. Then he said, "Your grandmother was one of the sharpest people I've ever met." "I know," I said. "I'm just saying." I was not ready to hear what he was saying. Not yet. I spent the next 4 days doing the ordinary, impossible work of grief. I helped my father coordinate the details of her memorial service. I sat through 2 hours at a funeral home choosing things. I wrote a eulogy that I rewrote 4 times because I kept trying to make it small enough to say out loud without breaking down, and it kept insisting on being exactly as large as she had actually been. At the service, I stood at the podium and looked out at 40-some people who had loved her in their various ways, and I talked about the lavender and the old books, and about the way she would stop in the middle of a conversation and look at you, really look, like she was taking a photograph she intended to keep. I made it through without crying, barely, by fixing my eyes on a spot on the back wall just above everyone's heads. My father did not give a eulogy. He said it was too hard. My mother held his hand throughout the service with the practiced tenderness of a woman performing a role she had long since learned by heart. Afterward, at the reception, my Aunt Diane found me standing alone near a window with a plate of food I was not eating. She put her hand on my arm and said quietly, "She talked about you all the time, you know. You were her great pride." I thanked her. She looked at me for a moment and then said, just as quietly, "Did you go to the house yet?" "No," I said. "Not yet." She nodded slowly. Something in her expression suggested she might be about to say more, but my father appeared at my elbow at that moment, clapping a hand on my shoulder and steering the conversation towards something easier, and the moment passed. I drove out to Mercer Road on a Thursday, 9 days after my grandmother died. I parked in front of the house and sat in my car for a while, looking at it. It was a Victorian-era house, 2 stories, with a wide front porch and the bones of what had once been a genuinely beautiful home. You could still see that through all the deterioration. The original woodwork was still visible under the peeling paint. The porch columns were intact if weathered. The windows, most of them, were unbroken, which felt like a small miracle. But the yard was overgrown and the gutters were pulling away from the roofline, and there was a look about the whole structure of a thing that had been abandoned mid-sentence. I walked the perimeter. I went up onto the front porch, which held my weight, and looked through one of the grimy front windows into a dim interior of dusty floors and old wallpaper. I tried the front door. It was locked. I had the key in my pocket, a heavy brass one that Gerald Finch had given me in an envelope after the reading, and I stood there with it for a moment before I used it. The smell inside was dust and thyme, and something faintly sweet beneath it that I could not immediately identify. The floors were original hardwood, dark with age but structurally sound as far as I could tell, no significant give or flex when I walked across them. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern peeling in the corners and along the ceiling line. There was furniture still inside, old pieces covered with white sheets, which gave the rooms a ghostly quality in the gray light that filtered through the windows. A dining room table, a sideboard, a parlor chair in the corner. Things left behind, or things left in place on purpose, I could not tell which. I went through every room. The kitchen was dated by several decades but not destroyed. The 2 bathrooms were going to need significant work. The upstairs bedrooms were dusty but intact. In what had clearly been the master bedroom, there was a vanity against one wall with a mirror that had developed a dark mottling at its edges, and hanging on the wall beside it was a small watercolor painting of a garden that I recognized immediately. My grandmother had painted it. I had watched her paint it one afternoon when I was about 9 years old, sitting beside her at a table in her garden on Ashford Lane, feeling the particular satisfaction of being allowed to simply be near someone in the full presence of their contentment. I had not known she had brought it here. I stood in front of it for a long time. On the drive home, I called a contractor named Pete Sandoval, who had been recommended by Marcus as someone reliable and straightforward. I told him I had a Victorian on Mercer Road that needed a full assessment and likely significant renovation work, and that I wanted to know what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. He said he could come out Friday morning. I said that was fine. Pete Sandoval was a compact, practical man in his mid-40s who wore the same expression of professional neutrality whether he was looking at a minor repair or what appeared to be a significant structural challenge. He walked through the house with me Friday morning with a flashlight and a notepad, making sounds that were non-committal in the way that experienced contractors make sounds, the particular professional language of not alarming a client before you have the full picture. At the end of the walkthrough, he stood on the front porch and looked at his notes. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said. "The foundation is solid, which is the main thing with a house this age. The roof needs to come off and be replaced. That's not optional. The plumbing is original in parts and needs to be brought up to code. Electrical is going to need updating throughout. The back porch has to be rebuilt. Cosmetically, there's a lot of work, but cosmetics are the easy part." He paused. "If you're asking me whether it's worth doing, structurally, the answer is yes. This is a good house. It's been neglected, but it's a good house." I asked him to put together a full estimate. He said he would have something to me by the following Wednesday. When the estimate came, it was substantial but not ruinous. I looked at my savings, which were modest but sufficient, and I made a decision. I called Pete Sandoval back and told him I wanted to move forward. Work began on a Monday, 2 weeks after my grandmother's death, with a crew of 6. Pete had explained the sequencing to me, roof first, then the mechanical systems, then the cosmetic work, and that the whole project would likely run 3 to 4 months, depending on what they found as they got into the walls. He had said that last part, the part about getting into the walls, in the matter-of-fact way a contractor says it, meaning only that old houses sometimes reveal additional complications when you open them up. I had nodded and said I understood. I was not living in the house during the renovation. I was still at my apartment. I drove by Mercer Road every couple of days to check on progress, talking briefly with Pete, walking through the parts of the house he indicated were safe to walk through, watching the slow, systematic work of bringing something back to life. There was something about it I found unexpectedly moving. The deliberateness of it, the care being applied to something that had been left alone for too long. My father called me one evening during the second week of work. He asked how the renovation was going, and I told him it had started, and that it was going well. There was a pause, and then he said, in the tone of someone offering helpful advice, "You know, Danny, you don't have to pour money into that place. It might make more sense financially to just sell the land and cut your losses." I told him I appreciated the thought. "Your grandfather bought that property for almost nothing," he said. "It's not like it has significant value beyond the land, and even that," he stopped himself. "I just don't want to see you throw good money after bad." I told him I would think about it. After I hung up, I sat with the conversation for a while. I noticed that he had not asked how I was doing. I noticed that he had not mentioned my grandmother once. I noticed that the concern he was expressing was framed entirely in terms of money. And I noticed that his preference seemed to be for me to disengage from the property entirely. And I noticed that I noticed all of this, and still I did not know what to do with it. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 17 days after work had started. I was at my desk at work, staring at a document I could not concentrate on, when my phone vibrated. The number was Pete Sandoval's. "Mr. Voss," he said when I picked up, and something in his voice was different. Not alarmed exactly, but altered. The professional neutrality was still there, but it was covering something now, the way a drop cloth covers a shape and tells you there is a shape without telling you what shape it is. "We've run into something in the east wall of the parlor. One of my guys was removing the lath and plaster in prep for the rewiring, and he found something. I'd rather show you than describe it." "What kind of something?" I said. He stopped. "You should come see for yourself." "Is it a structural problem?" I asked. "Mold? What are we talking about? A pause. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, like he had moved away from his crew. No, it's not structural. Look, I don't want to say the wrong thing over the phone. Can you come out this afternoon? I said I could come in an hour. I put my phone down and looked at my computer screen without seeing it. Something in his voice had done something to the air in the room. I picked up my keys. I was 20 minutes away from Mercer Road when my phone rang again. It was Pete Sandoval again. Mr. Voss. His voice was different again, lower still. There was noise in the background, voices, movement. I need to let you know there's been a development. While I was waiting for your call, Carlos opened up another section of wall further back in the cavity and... He stopped again. I could hear someone talking in the background. The police are here, he said. You should come now. I do not entirely remember the rest of that drive. I remember that my hands were very steady on the wheel, which surprised me because my chest felt like something large was pressing against it from the inside. I remember that I turned off the radio. I remember that I went through a yellow light I should have waited on. When I turned onto Mercer Road, I saw the police car before I saw the house. It was parked at the curb with its lights off, which for some reason was more unsettling than if they had been on. There were 2 officers standing outside, and Pete Sandoval was on the porch with Carlos, his lead carpenter, who was holding what appeared to be a crowbar, but standing completely still, like a man who had stopped mid-motion and not yet decided to restart. I parked and got out. One of the officers came toward me. "Daniel Voss?" he said. "Yes," I said. "You're the owner of this property?" "I am." He nodded, and something in his expression settled slightly. The particular shift that happens when a professional determines that the person in front of them is who they are supposed to be and not who they are worried about. "We got a call from the contractor," he said. "We're going to need you to come inside and look at something, and we'll need you to answer a few questions." We went inside. The parlor was on the left side of the house, a room I had walked through a dozen times in the past few weeks without it meaning anything in particular. Now it had been partially opened up, the plaster gone from one long section of the east wall, the old lath strips exposed and in some places removed, the interior cavity of the wall visible in a way that old houses never usually reveal themselves. And in that cavity, visible through the gap that Carlos's crowbar had created, was something that was not insulation and was not wiring and was not anything that belongs inside a wall. It was wrapped. That was the first thing I registered. Multiple objects, carefully wrapped in what appeared to be heavy plastic sheeting, secured with tape that had yellowed but held. They were stacked or arranged in a way that was clearly intentional. This was not something that had fallen into a wall cavity. This was something that had been placed there deliberately by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Pete Sandoval was beside me. He said quietly, "There's more." Down toward the baseboard there, and Carlos found another section in the north wall. I had him stop when I saw this. One of the officers said they had already called in a detective. Until that person arrived, they would prefer that nothing else be disturbed. I stood in the middle of the parlor of my grandmother's old house while the afternoon light came through the dusty windows, and I looked at the things inside the wall, and I remembered her voice. Trust the house. The detective's name was Marquez. She arrived within 40 minutes, which felt both very fast and extremely slow in the particular way that significant moments distort time. She was thorough and calm and asked me questions in a way that was clearly designed to determine whether I had any prior knowledge of what was in the walls, which I did not. And I think she believed me, because there is a particular kind of bewilderment that cannot be convincingly performed. They removed the packages from the wall cavity with care. There were 7 of them in the east wall and 4 in the north wall. They were not uniform in shape or size. Some were flat and rectangular, suggesting documents or paper. Some were smaller and denser, with a weight and solidity that made a particular sound when they were placed on the surface Pete had cleared for the purpose. And one, the largest, was a soft package that clinked when handled, a sound I recognized but could not immediately place until the detective cut through the plastic sheeting and the contents became visible. Gold. Coins and bars, nothing theatrical, nothing from a movie, but real and dull and heavy in the way that precious metals are heavy. Krugerrands, I would later learn, and American gold eagles, and several small bars with assay stamps, all carefully packed and stored and sealed and hidden inside the walls of a house that everyone had written off as worthless. I sat down on a dusty sheet-covered chair, and I said nothing. The detective said, "Mr. Voss, do you have any idea why your grandmother might have put these items in the walls of this house?" "No," I said. And then, "She said to trust the house." Detective Marquez looked at me. "When did she say that?" "About a week before she died." There was a pause in the room. Pete Sandoval was standing near the doorway looking at the floor. The officers were looking at the detective. Carlos had gone outside, and I did not blame him. "There are documents here too," the detective said, nodding toward the flat packages. "Once our forensics team processes them, you'll be able to see what they contain. Given that this is your property and there's no indication of criminal activity, this appears to be your inheritance, Mr. Voss. But we need to document everything before anything leaves the premises." I nodded. I looked at the gold arranged on the sheet and I thought about my grandmother's hands, the way they moved when she was cooking, precise and confident, the way she held a pen, the way she had held my hand in the hospital. It took several hours. I stayed throughout. At some point, Pete brought me a coffee from somewhere, and I drank it without tasting it. The forensics team came and photographed everything extensively. The detective asked me more questions. I answered them. At some point, I called Marcus and told him what was happening in the flattest voice I had ever heard come out of myself, and there was a long silence on his end, and then he said, "I'm on my way." And I did not argue. Marcus arrived while they were still documenting. He stood beside me in the parlor doorway and looked at the systematic, careful work happening in the room, and he did not say anything for a while. Then he said, very quietly, "She knew." "Yeah," I said. "She put it all here, for you." "Yeah," he shook his head slowly. "Danny, she knew." The documents were released to me 2 days later, after the detective's office had confirmed they were personal papers with no evidentiary value in any active matter. I took them home and sat at my kitchen table and read them, slowly, over the course of an entire evening. The first thing I found was a letter. It was handwritten in my grandmother's handwriting, which was distinctive and precise, with the particular character of someone who had learned penmanship in an era when penmanship was taken seriously. It was dated 14 months before her death. "My darling Daniel," it began. "If you are reading this, you found what I left for you, and I'm glad. I want to explain some things because you deserve an explanation, and because I have always believed that the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, is a form of respect." I read it 3 times that night, and I will try to put it into words now, though no summary can carry the exact weight of her voice on the page, that particular combination of directness and warmth that had always been the signature of how she moved through the world. She had begun to make these arrangements approximately 3 years before her death, when she had received a diagnosis that she had not shared with the family, but that had clarified in the way that such diagnoses always do, the finite nature of the time remaining. She had not panicked. She had thought carefully about what she knew of her family, and what she knew of money, and what she knew of her son. She did not write about my father with cruelty. That was the thing that struck me most. She wrote about him with the clear-eyed sadness of a woman who had watched a person she loved choose certain things over and over again throughout his life, and had finally made her peace with the fact that he was not going to choose differently. She wrote that she loved him, but that she did not trust him with abundance, that she had watched him in his marriage and in his business, and in the small daily choices of his life, become someone whose relationship to money was not healthy, someone for whom enough was never a stable condition. She wrote that she was not judging him for this, that she understood something about how it had developed, that there were things in his childhood she took some responsibility for, but that understanding a thing was different from being able to ignore it when making consequential decisions. She wrote about me. She wrote that she had watched me since I was small, and that what she had seen was someone who moved through the world with a kind of fundamental decency that she found both admirable and occasionally worrying, because decency without protection is simply exposure. She wrote that she had seen how I handled disappointment and injustice, how I absorbed things quietly and continued, and that she loved me for this quality, but was also frightened by it, because the world does not always reward the people who absorb quietly and continue. She wrote that she had intended to leave me a substantial share of the estate through the normal channels of the will, but that over the years she had seen enough of how my father operated when money was at stake to understand that whatever she designated for me publicly would likely be disputed, negotiated, reduced, or complicated in ways that would cost me money and years and pieces of myself that she did not want me to spend that way. She had spoken, she wrote, with Gerald Finch about this, and while Gerald was bound by his professional obligations in terms of the will itself, he had confirmed that whatever was placed inside the physical structure of the house was part of the property, and the property was going to Daniel. So she had done it the old way, the way people hid things before banks were trusted, the way her own grandmother, who had come through circumstances that made trust in institutions a luxury, had taught her that value could be stored in material and concealed and passed down through the intelligence of placement rather than the reliability of systems. The gold had been accumulated over years, purchased in small amounts through channels she described with the precision of someone who had thought about this very carefully, intent on not creating a visible pattern. The total, she wrote, was approximately $900,000 at the prices current when she was writing, though she noted that the nature of the asset meant it might be worth more by the time I found it, which, given the way the years had moved, it was. When Marcus later helped me calculate it properly, the current value was just over $1.3 million. There were also documents, stock certificates, some issued to bearer, an instrument she described as old-fashioned but reliable for exactly this kind of purpose. Bonds. The deed to a small piece of commercial property in another county that she had owned under a trust arrangement, and that had never appeared in the estate because it was held in a way that bypassed the estate entirely, passing directly to me through the trust structure upon her death, which Gerald Finch had handled and which required only my signature on a series of forms to complete the transfer. She had anticipated all of it. She had thought through every step with the patience and care of a woman who had decades of experience watching how wealth moves through families and what it does to people along the way. And at the end of the letter, in a paragraph that I read very slowly and then sat with for a long time, she wrote, "I am not giving you this because the others do not matter to me. I am giving it to you in this way because you are the one who would have been left with nothing and said nothing about it. You are the one who would have swallowed it and found a way to be fine. I know you. I have always known you. And the truth is that the version of you that absorbs and continues without bitterness is one of the finest things I've encountered in my life, but I did not want the world to take advantage of it one more time on my watch. Take this and build something beautiful. You already know how. The house will teach you if you let it." I did not tell my parents immediately. I'm not sure I can explain exactly why, except that I needed to understand the full shape of it first, and then I needed to spend some time just being with it, the way you sometimes need to be alone with something before you can introduce it to the rest of your life. I met with an estate attorney named Carol Webb, who had been recommended by Gerald Finch as someone who handled this kind of situation with competence and discretion. She reviewed everything and confirmed what my grandmother had laid out in her letter. The gold was mine, as property found within a property to which I held clear title. The stock certificates were mine, structured specifically to convey without probate. The bonds were mine. The commercial property in Hendricks County was mine, pending the trust transfer paperwork, which Carol Webb completed with me over 2 sessions. The total, when Carol Webb put a number on it in her careful way, was approximately $2.4 million. I sat in Carol Webb's office with this number and felt something very strange, which was not the feeling I might have expected. It was not triumph. It was not relief exactly, though there was relief in it. What it felt like, most precisely, was being seen. My grandmother had seen me clearly enough to know what would happen and to build an architecture around it that protected me without requiring me to fight, without requiring me to become someone I was not, in order to secure what was mine. She had done the fighting in advance, quietly, over years, with the same precise care she brought to everything. I called my father on a Friday afternoon. I told him I needed to talk to him and my mother together, and that it was about the Mercer Road property, and that it was important. He said they could meet me that evening, and something in my voice must have registered, because he said it with more uncertainty than I usually heard from him. We met at their house, which was a deliberate choice on my part. I wanted them in the space they felt most comfortable, most themselves, most certain of the shape of things, because I thought it was important that what shifted should shift in a place where they could feel the shifting clearly. I told them what had been found in the walls. I told them plainly and without drama, because I had decided that the facts themselves were dramatic enough and did not require any assistance from me. I watched their faces as I spoke. My father's expression moved through several phases in quick succession, something skeptical at first, then something calculating, then something that I can only describe as a rapid, involuntary recalibration, like a machine receiving a new set of inputs that contradicts the assumptions it had been operating on. My mother said, "That's not possible." It was the first thing either of them said. "It happened," I said. "But the house—" My father stopped. He looked at me and then looked away and then looked back. He stopped again. "She planned it," I said, "over years, specifically. She knew exactly what she was doing." There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality, the silence of a space being rearranged around new information, the furniture of understanding being moved into different positions. "Why would she—" my mother began, and then she stopped too, because the answer to the question she was starting to ask was a truth she did not want to look at directly. And something in her, some instinct, understood that finishing the sentence meant looking at it. My father stood up from his chair and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment. When he turned around, his face had settled into something I had not seen on him before, something older and quieter and less guarded than his usual expression. He said, "She never told me." "No," I said. "She did not. She could have spoken to me directly. If she had concerns, she could have—" "She wrote about that," I said, "in the letter. She thought about it. She decided it would not go the way she hoped." Another silence. My father looked at me, and I looked back at him, and in that moment I think we both understood something about each other, and about my grandmother, and about the gap between who we present ourselves as to the people who love us, and who those people can see us actually being when they look carefully enough. My mother said quietly, "She chose you." "She chose to protect me," I said. "Those are slightly different things." We sat in that room for another hour. It was not a comfortable hour. My father asked questions, some practical, some that were really not questions, so much as attempts to locate a version of events in which his mother's choices made different sense than they made. My mother said things I could hear her believing and things I could hear her saying to fill the silence. I answered what I could answer honestly and let the rest sit. When I left that evening, my father walked me to the door. He put his hand on the doorframe and looked at me and said, "Your grandmother loved you very much." "I know," I said. He stopped. "She saw things in people. She was very perceptive." He said it in the way of a man acknowledging something that costs him something to acknowledge. I said, "She saw things in you too, Dad. She wrote about that in the letter. She didn't leave things the way she did because she didn't love you." He looked at the floor for a moment. "Then why?" I thought about how to say it. "Because love and trust are different things," I said, "and she loved you both." I drove home in the dark, and somewhere on the empty evening highway, I cried, for the first time since she had died, really cried, the kind of crying that comes from a place below thought. I pulled over and let it happen, because it needed to happen, because I had been holding a lot of things in a lot of small containers, and the containers had reached their capacity. I cried for my grandmother, and for the 14 months she had spent building a secret architecture of care for me while she was preparing to leave the world. I cried for the 9-year-old boy sitting beside her in the garden watching her paint, not knowing that she was already the kind of person who understood what the world could take from you and tried to think 3 steps ahead. I cried because she had been right about all of it, and I hated that she had needed to be right about any of it, and I cried because she was gone, and all the gold in all the walls in the world cannot fix the fact of that. The renovation took 4 months. Pete Sandoval and his crew were as good as their reputation, and by the time they were done, the Mercer Roadhouse was not a broken-down Victorian sitting on a lot that someone had forgotten about. It was a house again. The roof was new, the plumbing was new, the electrical was new. The back porch had been rebuilt with the same proportions as the original, using period-appropriate materials that Pete had sourced with a care that impressed me. The interior had been repainted, and the floors had been refinished, and the original woodwork, where it had survived, had been painstakingly restored. The house smelled like fresh paint and sawdust and possibility. On the first day I spent alone in it, after the crew had finished and Pete had done his final walkthrough and shaken my hand and said in his practical way that it had been a pleasure and that this was a good house, I walked through every room. I walked through them slowly, touching things, the restored newel post at the bottom of the stairs, the refinished window frames, the kitchen cabinets that a Finnish carpenter named Jorge had built to match the original style. I stood in the parlor, where the east wall was now smooth and painted and gave no sign of what had once been inside it. I stood there for a long time. I had moved my grandmother's watercolor painting from the master bedroom to a spot in the parlor where it got the afternoon light. I had hung it myself, spending more time than was strictly necessary to get the height exactly right. It showed her garden on Ashford Lane, the roses she grew along the back fence, the stone path she had laid herself with my grandfather's help in the summer of 1972, the way the light came through the old oak tree at a particular hour of afternoon. She had painted it on a day when I was beside her, when she was well and the world was large, and neither of us was thinking about walls or wills or the things that time eventually requires of everyone. I looked at it in the afternoon light of the restored parlor, and I talked to her. I know that sounds like something a person says, and perhaps it is, but I did it anyway. The way you do things that cannot be explained when the person you most want to talk to is no longer available in the usual way. I told her I had found what she had left me. I told her I understood as much as I was capable of understanding why she had done it the way she had done it. I told her the house was beautiful, and that she had been right about it, and that she had been right about most things in general, and that I was sorry it had taken me this long to really receive that. I told her I was going to be okay. I told her I loved her. The commercial property in Hendricks County turned out to be a small office building that had been leased to a medical practice for years. It generated income. I did not need to do anything with it except sign the papers that Carol Webb had prepared, which transferred the trust and made it officially and unambiguously mine. I paid the estate attorney. I paid the contractor. I paid the taxes on everything that required taxes. I retained a financial advisor named Susan Park, who had been recommended by Carol Webb and who sat with me for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon and helped me understand what I had and what it could do if I was careful with it. I did not do anything dramatic with the money. That is not the kind of person I am. I set aside a substantial portion in long-term investments. I put a portion in reserve against future costs of maintaining the property. I donated a meaningful amount to the public library in the town where my grandmother had grown up, because she had told me once that the library there had been enormously important to her as a girl, that it had been the place where she understood that the world was larger than the particular corner she had been assigned, and that understanding a world was larger than your assigned corner was the beginning of being able to navigate it. I kept the Mercer Roadhouse. I moved into it. It took some adjustment, the way moving anywhere takes adjustment, the recalibration of habits to a new set of rooms. But the rooms were good rooms, and the house was a good house, and Pete Sandoval had been right about it. It had good bones. It had always had good bones, and what had seemed like abandonment was perhaps just waiting, the house patient in its deterioration, holding its secrets quietly in its walls until the right person came to open them up. Aunt Diane called me from Portland about a month after everything had become clear. She said she had heard some of what had happened, without specifying from whom, and that she was not surprised, and that Eleanor had always been 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room. She said, "She asked me once, a couple of years ago, whether I thought you would be all right. I told her I thought you would be, eventually, but that you needed someone in your corner." A pause. She said she would handle it. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about my grandmother, 80 years old and carrying a diagnosis she had not shared, driving to dealers in other cities to purchase gold coins in amounts that would not draw attention, working with Gerald Finch on trust structures and deed arrangements, writing a letter that she folded and sealed and placed inside a wrapped package inside a wall cavity of a house that everyone else had written off. The patience of it. The love that takes the shape of patience, that works in the background for years without recognition, that does not need to be seen in the moment because it is designed to be understood later. My father and I talk. Not the way we talked before, but we talk. There is a distance between us now that is not exactly new. It was always there, but it has been named, and named things are different from unnamed things even when they are the same size. He has not apologized in words, which does not surprise me. He has changed some things in how he speaks to me, how he asks after me, how he receives information I share about my life, and I choose to interpret this as the closest approximation of acknowledgement that he is currently capable of. My mother sent me a note, handwritten, which surprised me. It said that she had been doing a lot of thinking, and that she was sorry if she had not made it as clear as she should have that she valued me. It was doing a lot of work in that sentence, but I read it several times and I decided to keep it. I decided to accept what was being offered without requiring it to be more than it was. Grief is strange in the way it moves. You do not get over it. You do not leave it behind. What happens is more like what happens to a river that has to navigate new terrain. The river does not stop being a river, and the water does not stop moving, but the path it takes changes to accommodate what is in front of it, and the new path becomes part of the river's character in a way that cannot be separated from what the river is. I carry my grandmother differently now than I carried her in the first weeks after she died. The rawness has changed shape. What remains is something denser and less painful, a specific gravity, the weight of someone who mattered deeply and still does and always will. I sit sometimes in the parlor of the Mercer Roadhouse in the late afternoon, when the light comes in at a low angle and catches the watercolor painting on the wall and the restored hardwood floors, when the house is quiet and you can hear the neighborhood going about its business outside and feel the specific peace of a space that has been cared for. And I think about what my grandmother knew, and when she knew it, and how she chose to act on what she knew. She gave me a house when she could have given me a fraction of an estate. She gave me a house that everyone said was worthless, and inside the worthless house she put more than money. She put a lesson about the difference between what things appear to be and what they are. She put a lesson about the difference between what people announce and what they intend. She put a lesson about patience and precision and the particular power of a plan made without ego, made only in service of the person you are trying to protect. She put her faith in me, literally, inside the walls, trusting that I would not sell the house without looking at it first, that I would not dismiss it without giving it a chance, that I would be, in the end, the person she had always believed I was, the kind of person who looks closely at things and takes the time to understand what he is actually seeing. Trust the house, she had said, and I did. And the house held everything she had put in it, and I am standing in it now, in the light of a restored afternoon, in a life that is larger and quieter and more mine than it was before she left it, and I understand what she meant, finally, fully, the way you sometimes do not understand things until the understanding is complete, and what I understand is this. She never left me anything less than everything. She only hid it where she knew I would find it, and where she knew no one else would think to look, because they had already decided the house was worthless and there was nothing left to discover, while she had been counting on me to be the kind of person who keeps looking. I kept looking. I found her. I find her still, in the lavender smell that sometimes drifts through the open windows of the old house on Mercer Road in summer, in the watercolor light in the parlor, in the weight of a decision made with care and kept in secret and given freely, in the particular quality of being known by someone who took the time to know you all the way down and trusted what they found there. The house is full of her. It always was. I just had to open it up to see.